Back in the 1990s, I spent a lot of time playing Apogee games, long before I had what some might call an unhealthy obsession with first-person shooters, and the first games I played back on my dad's Commodore 286 were the old Apogee classics. Games like Biomenace, Cosmos, Cosmic Adventure, and of course Duke Nukem 1 and 2. Apogee software would eventually turn into 3D Realms, who would eventually work on Duke Nukem 3D, and we all know how things turned out after that. And then Interceptor Entertainment had links with 3D Realms during the work on Duke Nukem Reloaded, which would eventually end up with them creating 2016's Bombshell. Bombshell was a top-down action game that, truth be told, kind of went over my head. I mean, despite being developed by a development team with roots in the gaming industry, it was something that I just never paid much attention to, and it kind of seemed to come and go without much of a fuss. However though, when I heard that there was a Build Engine FPS prequel in the works, you better believe my ears pricked up, and I mean, just take a quick look at how the game's shaping up and you'll probably see what all the fuss is about. Developed by Voidpoint, who are comprised of guys formerly of Interceptor Entertainment and published by 3D Realms, Maiden is a game that feels like it's been pulled straight from 1996, with a purposefully antiquated colour palette and sprite work featured heavily over 3D modelling. Now that's not to say it's a bad looking game, because that couldn't be further from the truth. The sprite work pretty much across the board is absolutely gorgeous stuff to look at. The levels in the preview campaign take place in a really cool cyberpunk themed Washington DC as you explore city streets, subway tunnels, stations and office blocks, all of which are eerily reminiscent of William Shatner's Tech War. Whether or not that influence is intentional, I'm not really sure, but that's the vibe I got anyway. And even the main menu looks similar to the main menu from Wolfenstein 3D. Walls are covered in graffiti and posters and neon lighting is wrapped around buildings that stretch upward into the stratosphere, and there's even intricate little details like bottles of alcohol and other little incidental props scattered around interior areas. For a game that runs on a 20-something-year-old engine, it just looks amazing. But what's the whole game about? Well, I'm so glad you asked. Putting you into the boots of the ass-kicking Shelley Bombshell Harrison, working for the Global Defense Force, or GDF for short. Shelley's taken on the evil Dr. Haskell and his army, collecting keycards, exploring for secret areas, kicking ass, and chewing bubblegum.
Clean up on aisle your ass.
Along the way, you're going to be busting out plenty of one-liners as you effortlessly take down dozens of bad guys, and in true old-school FPS fashion, Shelley's portrait sits at the bottom of the screen, visually indicating her current condition alongside the health bar. Overall, it's a pretty good mix of the old and the new, and I mean, it's obviously running on what's a 20-something-year-old graphics engine, though it does do this through the eDuke source port, and it's also jam-packed with physics and more interactivity, I think, than any other Build Engine game that's come before it. So even for an FPS game made in 2018, it's pretty damn impressive. One thing I've always liked about Build Engine games was the way they handled explosions, especially in Blood and Duke Nukem 3D. I mean, it always felt that like whenever something exploded in those games, you really felt the earth shake beneath you. And it seems that level of carnage and power is brought across into Iron Maiden, and the shooting in general just feels really solid and precise. Now, it's still early days and all that, so the current build of the game is really following along with the old-fashioned shareware model we used to get back in the day. So what's on offer is a couple of different levels in one of the first zones, finishing off with a challenging boss fight against a large mech before it all comes to an end. Like a lot of those old shareware versions, you don't get access to all the weapons from the get-go, which is a bit of a cock tease, but even what is on offer is still pretty fun to mess around with. Without changing around the old archetype all that much, the starting weapon is expectedly a pistol, or revolver in this case, called the Loverboy, which fires a bunch of shots at once and does a decent amount of damage, though it's really only useful against single weaker opponents. Sitting in the third weapon slot is the expected shotgun named the Disperser, which kind of resembles a grenade launcher from Shadow Warrior. In fact, the first time I picked this thing up, that's what I thought it was. A really good shotgun is the staple of the FPS genre, and any so-called shooter that doesn't have one is a sheep in wolf's clothing. And like all good shotguns, you want to get up close and personal with this thing to use it effectively.
Ah, my bread and butter.
The fourth weapon slot is where the automatic weapon usually sits, and this is often a chain gun, minigun or nail gun, but this time around it's the SMG 9000. This thing's pretty badass too. It's got a nice firing rate and pretty decent damage, though it does have to be reloaded, which is a bit of a minor nuisance. Then lastly, sitting in the sixth weapon slot is the bowling bombs, which I think are the best weapons in the current build.
Nice.
Now these are grenades on the surface, but they will actively home in on enemies and they can do some pretty nice damage, jibbing a bunch of bad guys at once. The way you use these things reminds me of the dynamite bundle from Blood, even the way you can hold down the fire button to throw them further. And they're tricky to get the hang of, but they're great fun once you do.
Some assembly required.
Overall, the level of violence and carnage in Iron Maiden is pretty damn good. You'll stain nearby walls with blood as you blast enemies away by the dozen, and they let out a satisfying, distorted scream as you blow them away. Enemies are mostly just other guys with guns with varying amounts of health points. They're not the most intelligent bad guys though. I mean, you're not going to see them strafing all over the place like the Unreal Tournament bots or anything, but they do provide a decent enough challenge, and they can make your life a living hell if you don't play smart and you rush into rooms like an idiot. I was actually surprised at how challenging the game can be at times, in a good way, and you never feel like you're being cheated into death. I mean, getting killed feels pretty genuine, and there's usually something you could have done better to avoid it. Overall though, when everything clicks, it's a hell of a lot of fun. From the very first room you enter and start gunning guys down with the lover boy, it just feels like a joy to play. Playing through Iron Maiden really does just feel like you're playing some old DOS game from the 1990s, albeit a very good looking game that runs smoothly at high resolutions. And I think if any build engine game from back then had this much detail packed into the visuals, well, computers at the time would have probably spontaneously combusted. The soundtrack just kind of jams away in the background, doing its own thing without being too overpowering, and even the small sound effects, like when you're picking up little pieces of armor or health, remind me of playing older FPS games like Blakestone, sounding very similar to when games used to run on that old Sound Blaster configuration.
I spray, you pray.
So what didn't I like about the whole thing? Well, I mean, I don't like how short it is. I don't like that I don't get to play the full version right now, but that's not really a complaint, is it? We're seeing a real resurgence lately of a lot of these old school styled FPS games being made, and Iron Maiden is definitely going to find its place amongst the best of those. What's kind of funny too is that I started playing this pretty much right after I finished the god-awful Hunt Down the Freeman. I mean, it's like going from eating a crappy minute steak you bought at a service station to eating like a Wagyu beef cooked by a 3-star chef. We may never get a new Duke Nukem FPS, and I've long given up on expecting any kind of revival for Blood, but Iron Maiden does a good job of stacking up with the build engine bad boys of yesteryear, and it's definitely worth keeping an eye on to see how things progress. So check out the devs on Twitter and Steam, and maybe join their Discord server to show your support.
Dodge this.